Serious police officers of Reddit. What is the call you wish you hadn't taken? Former police dispatcher here. Lady got engaged to the love of her life. They had a beach party and 2 to 3 hours after he proposes, he goes swimming while pissed drunk. Had to spend 15 minutes talking to a woman while our diver found her fiancé. No currents, so it was a quick dive, but I'll never forget that call or her voice. What a brutal emotional swing in a day. That job fucked me up. Posted this before. 911 dispatcher. Stayed on the phone with a young kid hiding in his closet for 45 minutes as his dad beat the ever-loving shit out of his mother in the next room. They lived pretty far out from the nearest detachment, so it took a while for the officers to get there. Went to a unresponsive subject call. I get there and this 41-year-old man had died while running on the treadmill in his basement. He had been dead for about 4 hours when his wife found him. The decedent was first-generation Italian. Before the coroner arrived, his mother did. I knew that because I could hear her agonizing screaming from the driveway while I was still in the basement. We decided, because she was so hysterical and the coroner wasn't there yet, to keep her upstairs with family. She didn't speak English and was sobbing and crying on her knees at the foot of the stairs, begging to see him. Finally, the coroner arrived and they agreed to let her see him right before they loaded him in the van. When she saw him, she kind of ape-locked and the medics had to remind her to breathe. She was sobbing and having a conversation with him as if he was still her little baby and responding to her in his baby voice. It was so gut-wrenching to watch this. Fucked up my whole day. I'll never forget her. Father worked as a dispatcher as a kid saving money for a trip. The worst call or calls he ever took was from a man in his 50s calling the station to let them know he was going to kill himself. My father spoke to the man for as long as he could before he hung up the phone. He had to skip a phone call because he was so disturbed and broken mentally. The next phone call was from a 5-year-old boy who explained to my father that his dad had just shot himself with a shotgun on the back porch. After the phone call ended, my dad got up and left for the day, and no one questioned his decision. Our captain told of us a time where his friend was on his final minutes of his shift, literally coming back to the station to clock out, when a dispatch came out of a car collision. Ends up a drunk driver ran his truck into a car by running a red light over 60 miles per hour, boning the vehicle. When his friend arrived on scene, he recalls flashing his light within the car to reveal both the driver, a woman, and the passenger, a man, dead. What he wished he didn't see was the 3 children in the back of the car who had absolutely no chance of living through that. Worst of all, the drunk driver lived through the whole thing. A somber day in our small area of Nye. Our captain said his friend almost quit the force, went to therapy for 3 years, and ended up only doing a desk job until he retired and moved far away. My grandpa was a policeman in S/E South Dakota in the 60s 90s. Him and his partner were the responding officers to Jichi Manitow. 3 poachers murdered 4 teenagers while posing as D agents and then raped and released the 5th. Grandpa said he and his partner were throwing up everywhere. They were shot close range with 12 gauges. My dad was a cop, and there were 2 things he hated about the job. Going to really filthy apartments. No matter what, he'd walk out of them with roaches crawling on him. Going to a home where someone had been dead for more than a day. They used to keep cans of coffee in the trunk of squad cars just in case. You put coffee grounds on a pan on the stove and put the burner on low. It supposedly helped tackle the stink as the coffee scorched, but he said the stench would linger in your clothes/nose for hours or days, depending. Mind you, this was all before the days of CSI and all that. As time wore on, they started keeping Vicks VapoRub in their glove compartments. Put a couple of swabs of that right under your nose and you won't gag the whole time. We had a workout and social service for 1 day week at my high school. I got to drive with the EMTs for 1 day. Motorcycle crash. They said I should not see this and just go pick up the helmet that flew away. It was for just the helmet. The driver got decapitated. I went to pick up the head, only realized it halfway back. I dropped the helmet and had to puke. My school stopped doing those things. Used to work as a dispatcher. This guy in his 50s phoned up saying he hasn't heard from his son in a few days and was asking if we could come with him to his son's house to kick the door down to check he's okay. Pretty standard request. I'd usually ping it out to the officers, end the phone call, then an officer goes out to meet them within 60 minutes. Not this time though. The guy's already on his way to the son's house and wants me to stay on the phone with him while he's walking. He's telling me stories about going to his son's football matches, being a single dad all his life, and their close relationship. And it's at this point I start to feel a bit uneasy. About 20 minutes of talking has rolled by and the father has arrived at the house, and by this point he's worked himself up into a distressed mess and says he has to do something right away. I then listen to him crying and what sounds like him pounding and kicking at the door, begging for his son to let him in. He eventually boots the door off the hinges, and after a few seconds of silence I hear the dad let out the most mortifying wail I've ever heard. The son had died at the beginning of the week from diabetic shock. I couldn't hang up on him and had to just wait and listen to him break down until the ambulance arrived. From my dad. He responded to reports of a moving truck crash, and when he got there a U-Haul type van had rolled over in a ditch and the father was standing on the side of the road with third-degree burns holding his decapitated 4-year-old son. Another officer found the boy's head between the passenger door and his seat. The man died 2 weeks later from his injuries. The worst part? His wife watched the whole thing. She was following the van with their 3-year-old in the car. She lost her husband, her son, and everything she owned all in a matter of seconds. You know what is weird? I remember going to calls that upset or bothered me, but I can't really recall them right now that I'm put on the spot. I wonder if this is my brain helping me cope. I hope this is healthy and won't hurt me in the long run. My wife would probably have a better answer as she could remind me of stuff that had bothered me. I always hate going to calls involving death, especially when it's a person who is younger. The wails of grieving family members are horrible. From my father, who's a firefighter, but still joins police in many calls involving traffic accidents. Years ago him and his team went out to aid in one on the highway just outside our hometown. 2 girls had been trying to catch a ride at the side of the road for some time when they apparently decided to cross the south-headed lane. Why they decided to cross the road was never mentioned to me, but one of the girls made it over and went to turn around to talk to her friend when she witnessed her get run over by a truck going 100 km/h. My dad spent the rest of that call helping paramedics and police on the highway scooping up the girl's friend with shovels. It was my 3rd shift, and I was still getting used to how the station carried out their patrols. I was only 19 at the time. We had just picked up some food and headed back to the station when we got a call over the radio asking us to come down to the train line because the driver had hit something. We arrived at the tracks where 2 trains had been stopped. It was a part of the line where there were a lot of swans, so we thought it would just be the usual. We walked up alongside the train and sure enough we seen a swan, or what was left of it. But about 10 meters up from that we seen a pencil case. And then we seen a backpack. I felt my blood rush out of my face as I started to realize that there were body parts starting to appear the further we walked. We were the first on the scene, and I had basically no training and never expected to deal with this so soon. It was a kid who had tried to jump in front of the train, however had hit the side and got pulled under. The wheels made quick work of him unfortunately. Myself and my partner decided to try pull what was left of him from under the train, so the ambulance crew could have a quick jet away with the body. What really sticks out in my mind was the fact that people on the train were putting their phones out the window with the flashlights on, shouting at us for the delay. I didn't know how to respond. I thought I was going to pass out. I just felt like turning around and pretending it never happened. I had to take a statement from the driver. He had been a train driver for over 30 years, and the poor man couldn't speak to me. He couldn't speak to anyone. He retired the next day. The young boy had committed suicide, and we needed one of his relatives to identify the body. His uncle was a sergeant at the time, and he fainted when he seen the few pieces of him that was left. He also retired the following day. I still think about it now and then, but I've come to terms with it mostly. I'm not longer an officer and I believe that to be the driving factor. I just wish we had went back to the station with our food rather than take that call. Wasn't a police officer, but did security work. I think the story will fit what you're looking for though. I was doing flex work, where I was trained at all of the facilities in my area and could be called in at any time. I had been called out to a truck yard to cover for a sick on-site officer, was thinking about complaining because I had ended a shift about 9 hours ago and usually they have to give us 12 hours before our next site, but I wanted the extra money. About halfway into the shift my radio lights up. I ask the driver I'm helping to wait, so I can check the radio. It's the spotter, yard driver that moves trailers in the lot, yelling about something, but I couldn't really understand him as he's outside of his truck. I turn my cameras over and just see his truck next to someone else's and that's about it. I assume that he's in a fight and calling for me, so I apologize to the drivers in line and lock up. I get around the back lot and pull up to the spotter running at me. I get out and can hear a lady screaming her head off from between the trailers. I ask her to get out from between them, and when she gets out I can see someone on the ground. I already know that this is going to be a situation and asked the spotter if he had called 911 and let the plant manager on duty know he had. I get back to the rear axle and the guy is still alive, asking where his wife was. He was pinned under the wheels of a fully loaded trailer, and it was pretty evident that things weren't going to go well. I tell him an ambulance is on the way and I get back out from between the trailers and have his wife go back to be with him. I get back to the gate and have all the trucks waiting move out of the way for the ambulance. I had to have the site supervisor and the district manager come out. We called the other spotter in on his day off so that this one could go home. I was able to leave after my report. Turns out that they were trying to move the axles because they had been changed from a drop off at the yard to a drop in the doors. The rear axles can move forward and backwards along the holes in the beam under the trailers, but it sticks sometimes, so you have to pull the lever that is next to the rear wheels to pop a pin out while someone pulls the rig forwards or backwards. The pin slipped while the wife was pulling forward. He slipped, the pin reset in a hole, and the truck and trailer lurched forward enough to run him over. I knew he wasn't going to make it and he didn't. I was in the other side of the story. A couple of years ago, I was having a fun conversation with one of my colleagues. She was smiling and joking. It was a perfect Friday at the office. After a couple of minutes I went back to my desk while my colleague went to our boss office. Next thing I heard, about 5 minutes later, was a huge shout and cry, something I'll never forget. Our boss, assisted by a policeman dedicated to this kind of task, had informed her of the death of a 17-year-old son. He had been rolled over by a driver too busy texting while driving. We stayed with her till her family came to pick her up and go to the morgue. Her cries haunted us. Police offered us psychological support if needed. It's what they seem to do here in France. I left the company a couple of months later. It was too vivid for me, since I always remember how a life can be joyful and become an instant chaos in a snap of time. Don't feel like telling the whole story, but the lesson is, don't let your infant sleep in your bed with you. You will not wake up, and they will die, and it'll be your fault.